Hello. This week's shortish parsha, Toldos, sees the focus of the story shifting from the lives of Yitzchok and Rivka to their twins, Esav and Yaakov. I find it always fascinating every year to see that the stories which are supposed to demonstrate their primary characteristics, which the rabbis identify with Avram as chesed, kindness, Yitzchok, din, or gevura, a certain might, power, focus on kind of incisive ways of being, and Yaakov, which is emes, truth, don't actually seem to bring those ideas out at all, but quite the opposite, challenge them in those attributes. Perhaps the most significant example of that in the life of Avraham is the Akedah, where he is asked not just to kill someone, but to kill his own son, the very inversion or subversion of chesed, a very difficult story. But it's even more evident in the life of Yaakov, particularly in this week's parsha. We have a verse which comes from the book of Micha, Titen emes liYaakov, provide or give, ascribe truth to Yaakov. And throughout the rabbinic literature, Yaakov is described as a person of truth. The verses in this week's parsha describe him as Ishtam, a simple, straightforward person. Yet, all the stories seem to show him struggling with the aspect of truth. Beginning of this parsha, we have the birthright. He seems to trick his brother out of it. Esav's the elder. We have in next week's parsha, all the spotted and striped animals, when he's doing a business deal on which he seems to renege with his father-in-law Lavan. But perhaps most significantly is the story around the brochas, which occupies a large part of the end of this week's parsha, to remind us that Yitzchok is blind, he is old, and before he dies, he wishes to pass the baton, the blessing, as it were, to provide a sense who will continue the relationship with God and the monotheism that he, his wife, and his parents have built. To whom will that be passed in the next generation? That's what it means to give the bracha here. And he decides he's going to give this bracha to Esav, the elder son, and he gives him an instruction to prepare a meal, and while he is waiting for the meal to come back, you know the story, Rivka, his wife, overhears. She dresses Yaakov, the smooth son, in some hairy skins so that he feels like Esav, his brother, and he tricks his father and he receives the brachas instead. It's a very strange story, and it does appear to be perhaps the preeminent example of how Yaakov's life, supposedly characterized by truth, appears not to be. It seems that his ultimate challenge are in the attributes or his ability to behave truthfully. So of course there are many ways of explaining this sense of the lack of truth. It's well known that Rashi, quoting earlier sources, that at that moment when Yitzchok says, "Who are you?" and he says, "Onochi Esav b'chorecha," I am Esav, your firstborn, which appears to be directly untrue. Rashi encourages us to put a comma, "Onochi, I am," it's me. Oh, and Esav b'chorecha, Esav is your firstborn. It's not an argument that really holds water or stands up in court, and that Rashi requires very careful consideration on its own. At least there's perhaps some grain of truth, but it's not persuasive. I think Rashi wants to be certain that it's not an absolute, complete falsehood, but it doesn't seem to be a very truthful response. Other sources are more candid. Of course he lied, but the lying is justifiable because that he receives a prophecy or for some greater good. But either way, it's a very, very difficult and complex narrative. I want to address a very specific aspect of the tension between the two brothers, which perhaps enables us to understand the story of the blessings better. Right back from when Rivka is pregnant, they start off unable to have children, but eventually Rivka conceives, Vayisroitzatsu habonim b'kirbo. And the children, she appears to be aware, or the story at least understands that she is bearing twins, and the twins struggle, Vayisroitzu, run about. It means they irritated, of course, as a quite an entertaining midrash, which suggests this is because Esav is hairy and Yaakov is smooth, and he tickles him, but the way this is understood is there is some existential, built-in conflict between them. They are fighting in the womb already. And after they are born, We hear Vayehav Yitzchok es Esov Kitzai Befiv. Yitzchok loved Esov because the trap was in his mouth. V'Rivka oheves es Yaakov, but Rivka loved Yaakov. And the tension begins. Yitzchok favours Esov and Rivka favours Yaakov. And why might that be? Well, there are numerous attempts to explain this. Rashi doesn't like the idea that Yitzchok likes Esov because he provides him with a good dinner. The trap is in his mouth. So he says the mouth, the subject of the mouth, refers to Esov. There was a trap in his mouth because he was a trickster. He used to pretend to be something he wasn't. He came over all pious and frum, but in fact he was a charlatan. That's how Rashi likes to read the story. In contrast, Rivka could see, remember Yitzchok is blind, Rivka could see what he was really up to, so preferred Yaakov. The Ishbitzer, one of my intellectual heroes, takes a rather different view, that Yaakov, whom the Ishbitzer doesn't much like, is not really engaged with the struggles of the real world, wants to sit in a tent, wants the world to pass by, wants the world to live in a black and white space. Something Rivka identifies, but Yitzchok, who understands the complexity of the unredeemed world, identifies with the struggles, the real world struggles of Esov. Another way of reading it is Rav Hirsch, of which I'm very fond. Rav Hirsch says, writing in the mid-19th century Germany, Rav Hirsch explains that Rivka grew up in a home with a trickster. We'll learn all about Lovon. We've already met him briefly and we're going to meet him again next week. Lovon's a trickster. Rivka is well used to the behaviour, the speech, the subterfuge of someone who is a trickster, sees it in her son Esov, and therefore veers towards Yaakov. Yitzchok, more naive, and also, as we said, blind, may not see this. But what was the objective? Well, how can you steal a brocha? Surely a brocha that is given under false pretenses is void. And not only is it void, we would assume that the person who attempted to trick his father out of a brocha would be punished for his reprehensible behaviour. And yet, at the moment when Yitzchok discovers that he's been tricked, which is of course when Esau returns and he realises what's happened, he says, well, the guy who came and tricked me, Gam Boruch Yehieh, he should also be blessed. You'd have expected anger, punishment, rejection, distress, and maybe even a curse, but there is none of this. Based on this, Rav Hirsch again understands that the correct reading must be as follows. And in order to properly understand the story, we need to read the whole or the early part of the verse that I just mentioned. At that moment, Vayecherad Yitzchok charodo gedoylo ad ma'od, Yitzchok was seized with a tremendously great trembling when Esau arrived and he realised what had happened. And then he says, who was that? Who came before? Gam Baruch Yehieh. He should also be blessed. Now, Rashi, quoting a Midrash Tanchuma, says, what was the trembling? Ura Gehinom Pesucho mitachtov. He saw Gehinnom, hell as it were, yawning beneath him, which normally is understood to mean that he realised he'd almost given the bracha to the wrong person, and therefore now he can at least give it to Yitzchok. To Esau. But that doesn't fit with the fact that he gives him a blessing afterwards. So Rav here says one needs to reread the entire story. We know that Rivka sees what Esau is really up to from his earliest years. And she has spent a lifetime trying to persuade Yitzchok, her husband, that Esau is not what he seems. That it will be a terrible error to pass the baton of spirituality and monotheism onto this son who appears to be a tzaddik, but in fact is very far from this. And Rivka has been unsuccessful. Yitzchok can't see it. Yitzchok is a very complex and uninteresting character, perhaps for another time, but Yitzchok can't see it. And finally the moment of truth comes. Yitzchok is old, he doesn't know how long he will live for, and the moment that Rivka had feared has arrived. He's now actually going to pass the baton to the next generation, and he's going to give it to the wrong person, which means an emergency intervention is required. Hence, Rivka dresses up Yaakov, knowing, of course, that this subterfuge, this ruse would always be discovered. And in fact, it was designed to be discovered. How could it not be discovered? She surely knew that when Esau returned, Yitzchak would piece together what had happened, and the finger of blame would be pointed at Yaakov and by extension Rivka. Says Rav Hirsch, the only possible explanation is that was the plan. And the plan really was not just to understand that he'd been tricked by Yaakov, but that meant by extension, and perhaps suddenly he could see it, that he'd been tricked by Esav all his life. So says Rav Hirsch, Vayecherad Yitzchok chorodo gadoilo ad ma'od. When Yitzchok was seized with an extremely great trembling and he saw Gehinnom, hell, yawning beneath him, he suddenly realised that he'd been tricked all his life and he'd nearly totally destroyed the project that had been handed to him by Avram, and which it was his sacred duty to pass to the correct member of the next generation. He realised that he nearly had failed to give it to Yaakov, and only through Rivka's intervention had Yaakov after all ended with the blessing. And hence he says, the gam baruch yeh. He should also be blessed. He deserves the blessing because now I understand. This extraordinary reading of Rav Hirsch radically transforms the story. Of course, it's not without its problems. It turns it into a struggle for the recognition of the right way to move to the next generation between Yitzchak and Rivka. And it sets the scene for what happens next. And it also perhaps helps us a little better to understand why it is that Yaakov's remarkable and extraordinary behaviour, which seems so unjustifiable, perhaps was reasonable after all. Shabbos and Sei gesund and stark.